pull up on our PowerPoint real quick. Want to click?
It's under Google Doc under group number 1. On the week 13 page, if you refresh it.
So for our lesson, it's aimed at a 9th grade classroom, so put on your 9th grade thinking caps, so it'll be good. So as you guys remember from our last class, we were studying the 1910s and World War I and the effect of that on American culture. And today we're going to be moving on to the 1920s, also known as the Roaring 20s, where you have the age of jazz, you have men coming home from World War I, conservative politics, laissez-faire, and a booming economy. So if you remember last time, with World War I, you had a lot of men who went over to Europe, so that's a gap in the economy. So you have a lot of women who are entering factories, you have African Americans who are moving from the south up to the northern factories, so Chicago, Detroit. And then you have conservative politics during the time, so they're kind of saying, okay, we're going to keep hands off of the economy, let the businesses take control. As a result of that, during the 1920s, you have a lot more money in circulation, and you have the men coming home from the war. So people are like, yeah, we want to have a lot more leisure time. We don't want to be restrained by these politics and everything. We want to have some fun. So you have the rise of the 1920s. You can probably think of some books during the time that came out.
A lot of people started reading Sigmund Freud.
Yeah, Sigmund Freud, stuff like that. So this is kind of like a general thing that's going on during this time. The status of women is rising. People are smoking cigarettes, they're dancing. A lot of the norms are changing. And that's kind of what we're going to go over today.
So as Kelly has explained the different changes that have occurred, we actually have 2 video links. The first link is going to show you a little clip about the pre-World War I. So this was like when women were starting to get, this was when World War I was starting, and women were starting to become nurses and health aid during the World War I. And then the video 2 will be post-World War I. So this is just how things are changing for women after the war has ended. So if you want to click on the first video link, you're only going to watch about 30 to 40 seconds of the clip. I believe it's probably 2 minutes long or 4 minutes. But you just need the first 30 just to get a view of that. And then you're going to log in as a visitor. So all you need is your email. And then
It's going to have video links. So if you sign in as guest, you can get to our video page.
just hit accept. You're just going to watch the first.
And then add annotations as you watch the first 30, 40 seconds. Just, add a couple annotations. What are you seeing? What are you thinking? Get your mind churning. So if you guys want to go ahead and start, and we'll come back in about 2 minutes.
Country suddenly
Just have to watch the first 30 to 40 seconds of each video.
Yeah.
You don't have to watch the whole clips.
Yeah, and you should be on your post-World War I video.
And remember, you only need about 1 annotation
women changed, how they appeared to change from the 1910s and the 1920s. So think about the annotations that you made as you watched the videos. What were your thoughts on the women, and how are those thoughts different? How are the women different? And then if you can, text those in.
You can also click on the image and it'll send you to a link which you can write in here. Type in the box. You don't have to type it.
Yeah, typing might be, you know, shoddy signal reception in the building.
I like the first response.
You can click on week 13. Yeah. Good job. Yeah, you just click on week 13 under, yeah, there you go.
Oh, I like the fashion judgment that's going on. There's a lot here. You don't like that old guy from the Victorian age, guys? Those sunsets? They look really cool.
Cigarette.
A lot of time, I think it's a way to wear, so it actually would deform people's rib cages. It's rather unfortunate.
And during this time, the hair is actually double.
Yeah, that's pretty good.
Alright,
So now you guys, a lot of you touched base on what we're gonna actually be presenting over. And so, which is gonna be the fun, the entertainment that you all noticed, like, that's something that was definitely, noticeable during this time. So,
we're going to go through a few individual examples of how things have changed between the 1910s to the 1920s. And then at the end, after we go over these few examples, we'll have kind of a discussion about it. So just to introduce one change that we want to talk about is fashion. So a lot of you guys are talking about this with our Poll Anywhere question. You saw this in our videos. So we have here on the left a Gibson girl. This is our lady from the 1910s. And we have over here on the right our flapper women from the 1920s. So just, you know, looking at these photos, what are you guys seeing? What are some differences between these two women? Does anybody have any thoughts? Madison?
There's more skin showing than the one from 1920s.
Yeah, definitely. We have a lot of leg going on there. We have some ankles out. That's never been seen before. Anyone else? What are some things we're seeing? Jeff, what do you, your
They
attention?
like the hats or whatever those are. Well, I guess she has a hat in the first one, but
Yeah, we're
they're
going
all
maybe
having
from,
the same.
yeah, here's maybe more of a structured hat. You know, it's got a bill keeping maybe the sun out of the face, keeping your skin dainty. Over here we have more of like a little cap going on, more fitted to your head so that when you're dancing around, you're not losing your hat. What about hairstyles? Does anybody see any difference between the hairstyles of the two women? Amisa? Shorter, so we have shorter hair. You know, we have a more feminine hairstyle going on over here. It's more styled, took probably a little bit more time to get ready in the morning. Over here we just have a really simple short bob cut. She probably just woke up, rolled right out of bed, threw that cap on and went down the street to have some fun, right? What about anything else? Is there anything different that we're seeing maybe in the shape of these two women?
Seems like the 20s women have like more flowing figure. They don't have like the trim waistline thing going on.
Yeah, definitely. If we look over here, we have that hourglass figure going on. We have a more curvaceous woman. Whereas if we look at our flappers, they're very boxy, very straight, kind of a little bit boyish. So those are definitely some great examples of differences. Okay, and now we're going to talk a little bit, this is another example of some changes we're seeing into the 1920s. We're going to show a short video about the Harlem Renaissance, and then we're going to talk about that after we watch a little video.
Might have turned the volume on the actual in the upper right hand corner on the computer.
No.
No, just the video. There you go.
For many, the 1920s evokes images of flappers and speakeasies. But for one group of Americans, the decade was also one of rebirth. It was known as the Harlem Renaissance. For the first time, African American writers, artists, and musicians won renown for their contributions to world culture. Their goal? To find outlets for group expression and self-determination as a means of achieving equality and civil rights. When World War I broke out, American factories experienced a shortage of workers. Many Black Americans living in the South saw this as their chance for a better life. They migrated in droves to northern cities, such as Chicago, Detroit, and New York. The New York City neighborhood of Harlem, in particular, attracted a large number of African American artists and intellectuals. It wasn't long before Harlem became the epicenter of an artistic explosion. Works produced during the Harlem Renaissance appealed not just to blacks, but crossed over to white audiences as well. The musical.
Alright, so as the video kind of talked about, we're seeing a renaissance for African American people. During the late 1800s, we went through the American Civil War, the end of slavery. African Americans are finally having the ability to kind of educate themselves through traditional means, through school. As a result of that, we're seeing authors come into play, African American authors, playwrights, people like that. And they're kind of getting equal footing in the social scene.
One of the examples of that you'll recognize is Langston Hughes, who's a major poet during this time.
Yeah, the video was going to talk about, a major playwright, and they're having a major Broadway play featuring African Americans. So for the first time, we're seeing African Americans kind of being, a major player in society, that their lives, their stories, their needs are kind of mattering, essentially, to people. Does that seem like it's a little bit different from previous eras in American history? Yeah, but we know that they're still going to go through quite a bit of a struggle there.
So the next set that we're going to talk about, along with the Harlem Renaissance, we have the rising age of jazz. So here's a question for you. What do you guys think of when you think of jazz? One word answer is fine. Like, what pops in your head right away?
Elevator music.
That is one.
How long do you say that's 2 words?
The hype, not the hype music.
It works.
Improvising.
Definitely, that's one of the major things for jazz is improv. For those of you who don't know what improv is, it's essentially when you will be playing a song and either the entire band or a soloist will just break away from what's written on the page and they'll just completely improvise what's going on. So they will either make a variation on the melody or they'll just do whatever they want and just kind of like jazz out. So what else? What else do you think of when you think of jazz? Yeah, Madison?
Soulful.
Yep, that's another one. You have blues going on this time. Anything else? Maybe one more.
I think of a saxophone.
Yep. Kind of like the 2 key instruments that you usually think of for jazz is going to be trumpet and the saxophone, which leads me to our wonderful example, Louis Armstrong. His nickname was Satchmo, and he's really, really famous for 2 things. First, his voice. You may recognize his voice in What a Wonderful World, one of his biggest hits. And also, he was a virtuoso, pretty much like a genius when it comes to playing the trumpet. What's really interesting during this time is the people that were at the head of jazz was the African American population. And here's another question for you. Does anyone know what 3 major cities kind of hosted the jazz movement?
New Orleans.
Chicago.
New Orleans was one.
Chicago.
Chicago, and one more. Nope.
New York.
Yes, whoever said New York. So yes, the 3 main hubs are Chicago, New Orleans, and New York. It started off in New Orleans, and for those of you who don't know, jazz is actually a combination of 2 different styles of music. You have the harmonies of Europe in combination with African American tribal music. And it started actually in the late 1800s with ragtime, and it comes from its tradition of New Orleans funerals. So instead of like a really sad progression where you're like, oh, it's really sad, someone just died, you actually have people that have like a marching band, and they're kind of like celebrating the life of this person. So they're kind of like jazzing out, like, yeah, this is awesome, we're celebrating this person's life. And it kind of comes from that tradition. So you have the rise of jazz artists in the early 1900s, such as Joe King. He's a really famous trumpet player, and Louis Armstrong actually was one of his mentees, and he followed him up north where a lot of the movement was going to. So this is really just a time of experimenting with music. You're bringing in new things like swing. You're bringing in stuff like soloists and dancing. So it's really going against those conventional norms of like classical music and really strict waltzes, stuff like that. So we will play 40 seconds of Louis Armstrong. So that's a little bit of an excerpt of Louis Armstrong playing actually earlier on in his career. And Louis Armstrong is also really, really famous, and he represents some of the more successful jazz artists in that he was able to cross over. So as was mentioned in the Harlem Renaissance video, not only was the African American cultural context like just for African Americans, really successful musicians like Louis Armstrong were able to cross over and perform for white audiences as well. So they were able to kind of like represent their population and everything like that. So kind of like loosening tensions between the two races at that point, which is really awesome. So besides that, we also see that not only is the music restrained to the 1920s, music, like everything else in history, affects things in the future. So this music in the 1920s expands to big band stuff like you see Glenn Miller, and that's going to be a lot more swing, fast, really like furious music that's really popular during World War II. And one of those famous pieces for jazz is in the movie. People will be dancing to this in speakeasies where they're selling alcohol during Prohibition. So kind of going into stereotypes. So that will move on to dance.
So now we just talked about jazz. What usually goes with jazz or with music? What do you usually see? Dancing, yes. So this is actually a time where dancing is changing, just like everything else. People weren't just doing the waltz anymore. They didn't have a big box in between the partners. Everyone was doing dancing changed. People started doing the Charleston, the foxtrot. These were really popular dances that were being people were doing dancing to. And one thing that people started doing more is they're closer to each other. So dancing wasn't, you weren't far from your partner, you were more close. It was more of a sexual flow kind of thing. But when it came to dancing, it was very, as we talked about fashion, clothes were also being changed for dancing too. People were wearing looser outfits. They were able to like move their arms more, and they could do more swings and more flips and things like that when it came to dancing. And one trick that we have.
Brief commercial interruption.
But see how you can see that they're also closer to each other. More. So, but going off of that also, so now we're gonna like go into a discussion with everything that we talked about. So, how did these individual changes continue to a larger cultural change in society?
So if you guys want to maybe take a minute, think about the examples that we discussed. Think about fashion, think about dancing, music, the rise of African Americans in literature and playwrights. How do these things indicate the overall changes that are happening in society in the United States during the 1920s? And this goes back to a little bit about what Kelly was talking about in our introduction. You know, we have the end of World War I, we have men returning. So, you know, think for a minute, and if you guys want to add some comments about, you know, what's happening with the role of women or the role of African Americans.
If you want to, like, during the minute you're thinking about, feel free to kind of talk to the partner next to you, kind of collaborate on like some ideas you might want to support.
And some new things that are coming out of political too is like, for instance, the new amendments are coming out, and so just think about that as well.
Give you a hint, one of them's the 20th Amendment.
In the 19th.
19. Oh, the 1920. It's the 19. Sorry. So the 19th Amendment that came out in 1920.
I was crunching the numbers in my head. I was like,
I was
okay,
like,
17 is 18 is prohibition, and then
Yeah, you're doing like weights. My bad.
Jeff, do you have an answer?
Well, with the hint of the 19th.
Some larger cultural changes?
Yeah, it seems like it's gonna, we have like finally equality for everyone, so like women were getting the right to vote. African Americans were being, they were kind of the crossover into, like white society as what was in the beginning, whatever, yeah, it's becoming a little bit more equal, at least they're like taking a step in that direction.
Yeah.
Well,
Jeff?
yeah, well, why do you think that is?
Hey everyone, we're going to start the discussion now, so if you could finish whatever your last sentences with your partner.
There are points of joy, right? Like when people are working or something.
Chris, if you want to join our discussion. Chris, we're going to start our discussion now, so you know, finalize your thoughts. So Jeff was discussing equality. So who could think of maybe, you know, how is the changing fashions of women representing, you know, a change in their ability to get equality? Does anybody have any ideas in, you know, the changing fashions? How does that contribute to a change in equality of the status of women?
Why would the clothes make a difference?
Jeff, do you have another?
Maybe more freedom and they got to choose more of what they wanted to wear.
Yeah, we see women finally acting out, they're dancing, they're moving, they're being big, they're coming out of these small feminine roles and, you know, becoming loud and wild women.
They're kind of pushing back against societal norms. You have to keep in mind that we're coming from the Victorian age, where the woman's place was in the domestic sphere. She's supposed to stay at home, be the moral force of the family, take care of the children. So the fact that she's going out, she's also shopping at department stores with credit cards, because that's now a thing. She's going out, she's shopping, she's having fun with her friends, she's smoking, which that was a man's habit. You're not supposed to smoke if you're a woman. So these ideas of women's rights and control over your own life to do what you want is really important during this time, and it's a progression that continues on to like the 50s and the 60s into the 21st century.
They're embracing more of their freedom, more of their independence. They're not doing what their parents did before. They're more open, especially about their sexualities and things like that. As for example, the use of books that people were reading.
So what are some more examples that you guys thought of larger societal changes that are being indicated by these little examples?
I think it seems like African Americans developing their own culture of arts and women developing their own version of their images, allowing them, like you said, to come out of those roles, but also develop like a more broad picture of what a woman is or what an African American is. So in that sense, it's kind of like opening up society to accepting that like people are a spectrum, not so much as like one stereotyped group. So then that would lead to things like equality because they're seen on equal footing with
Slow
people who are
progress.
empowered.
Yeah, there's definitely like a slow progress going on. There's some fighting back. For instance, African Americans, although they are gaining more rights, there's more of them entering skilled professions during this time. There's also a fight back in 1919. There were race riots in Chicago because there are a lot of people that are angry about black men going into factories and breaking strikes, stuff like that. So there's definitely a push back to this movement, just like any movement in history.
Yeah, and I think one thing that's really important to consider, we didn't necessarily talk about this because it's a whole other topic, but the international relations of the 1920s, we're seeing a lot of isolationism in the United States international policies, we're getting involved less in conflicts abroad. So do you think that would maybe have more of like a focusing insular effect on the culture of the United States? Do you guys think that that could maybe contribute to some of the growth that we're seeing in minority populations? What do you guys think about that?
Well, it definitely affected immigration policies. So there was very much after World War I a contraction of what immigrant groups could immigrate and the numbers that they could.
Yeah, and so what effects do the limitations of immigration have? Is that again making it a more insular focused society? But do the people who are living in the United States as a result of, less immigration, are they seeing their ability to kind of grow as a result of that? What do you guys think?
Well, I don't know if this is an answer to that question per se, but I think the fact that people were starting to question the government and laws and like things like prohibition speaks volumes about the like national mindset. And I think that was like the first period of serious indulgence. And I think that we saw it again in like the 60s in different ways and like kind of even like now arguably. So I don't know if that really relates to immigration policy, but just the fact that so many rules were being broken and so many people were benefiting in so many ways, political and otherwise, I don't know.
That's actually a really good point that you brought up. The idea that you're kind of like pushing back against things,
Yeah.
and there's this leisure and like treating yourself to stuff. If you guys remember, this is right 1929 when we had the stock market crash, and a lot of people before this are going out to places and they're spending money they don't fucking have it. This is the beginning of the credit card, our greatest fear in life. So here's another question. What do you see in the 1920s that's reflected in our culture today? Are there any parallels here? Do you think we're as irresponsible now as we were then? Or do you think we're like a completely different era now?
I think of equality, like you see during the 1920s, how can you see it, how can you relate it to now as well? You notice anything with that? What's in the news, what's really like big right now?
I don't want to rant.
Like from comparing how we saw in the 1920s, like the equality and everything, so how do you see it today? How can you compare that today? What equality do you see today? Or
Not even necessarily equality.
Yeah.
It can also be like, what are general parallels between the 1920s and now? It can be with the economy, it can be with like social institutions, women's rights, African Americans, minority, like treatment of minority groups. Is there like any parallels that you kind of see between the two?
are they completely different?
Sophia,
There's a couple.
Go ahead.
Rights for people who are not heterosexual. Cannabis, I'll just leave it at that. Hoarding of wealth, what with all the gang life that was alive in the 20s, and those were the people who had the most money, and those were the people who were backing all the politicians and all of that. So, yeah.
You have the really high and the really low.
Exactly.
This is a time of great disparity between the richest and the poorest in American society. And that's something that we see even today. Just think of the Tea Party movement. I'm the 99%, I want my fair share. Like, stuff like that hasn't gone away. So as you can see, there are definitely some parallels that go on between the two.
Does anyone else have any thoughts about either general social changes that were occurring in the 1920s or general parallels between the 1920s and today? Anybody who maybe hasn't shared yet?
We kind of said that the 1920s is like really fun and like carefree generation, and almost has to do with like YOLO. I think that the 20s were YOLOing long before it was cool.
I like your interpretation of events. Okay. Well, if anyone else doesn't have any questions, we'll just wrap up, and thank you very much for participating.